I think the Somali government has probably got four big challenges it's facing in terms of consolidating peace and security at the moment. The first one I'd identify is just capacity issues. The government has come into power in September of last year, but it's lacked really the capacity in a number of areas. The security forces, in terms of its army and its police and its intelligence services, remain weak and largely uncoordinated and unable to pursue the goals that a fully fledged security service would be able to provide. And also its administrative capacity. It lacks a civil service, for want of a better term, and to actually run and manage a government. So the first big challenge is increasing the capacity of the government to get things done. I would say the second big challenge it's faced is that it's come into office late last year and faced a number of problems around de facto authorities in different regions of Somalia. So the government, although it's nominally a federal government, is not actually in control of the whole of Somalia. We see Somaliland obviously declaring independence many decades ago, Puntland operating with a degree of authority, but more crucially for the government when it arrived in power, we saw sort of de facto regional authorities in Jubaland in the south and in Bay and Bakul regions in more central Somalia. So the second big challenge that the government's had to face is how to basically deal with the political conflicts that have arisen with those different regional authorities, and how it's going to come to a consensus with those different groups about how we should interpret the new Somali constitution and how we should basically establish a federal government with power across the land. And then I think the third challenge it's faced, which is a major concern of the sort of external donor community, is corruption and issues to do with financial accountability and transparency. And here we've seen, I think, a number of problematic efforts. The World Bank and IMF and others have pointed to the huge levels of corruption and missing funds and money. As much as 70% of the money that's been going to the central government has somehow disappeared. So all the things that the federal government can do to sort of clamp down on that financial aspect of corruption is important. And then I think the fourth and final challenge I'd identify is that it has to work effectively with the African Union mission in Somalia and with the new UN mission in Somalia to coordinate the political agenda that those actors are going to try and push forward. And there I think the problem is that, in particular with AMISOM, the mission is still lacking a number of key capabilities that it's been asking for the last few years. Particularly in terms of taking the fight to Shabaab, AMISOM is still lacking military attack helicopters and other military utility helicopters. It's still missing a number of soldiers, in particular the Guard Force that was authorised a couple of years ago now in UN Security Council resolutions, which is meant to protect and ferry around VIPs in Somalia, has still not materialised. And the force commander has been asking for several thousand more troops to help deal with the challenges. So I think those four put together are really the major obstacles that the government faces. That's a good question. Obviously, the events we've seen over the last week at Westgate Mall have had a big set of aftershocks in the region, and obviously it's a bit too early to tell exactly what impact they're going to have, but to speculate a little bit here based on past trends, I think number one, it shows the interconnectedness of the region. You know, the Somali conflict zone is not hermetically sealed off. Al-Shabaab has clearly demonstrated, both through these Westgate Mall attacks, but also in previous years, that its reach can extend beyond Somalia. And so Somalia's conflict zone, whether it extends to bombings in Kampala or attacks on the mall in Westgate or attacks in Mogadishu and elsewhere, shows how interconnected the regional conflict dynamics are. And that's likely to continue and not change anytime soon. Secondly, I think it tells us, or gives us at least a little bit of insight into what's been happening in Al-Shabaab in recent months and how Al-Shabaab is sort of changing its tactics and potentially strategies. And here I think the important point to mention is that earlier this year, Al-Shabaab has been going through a period of really intense internal turmoil. In April this year, a letter was circulated on various internet websites where a number of Al-Shabaab sort of deputy and quite senior leaders criticised Ahmed Ghadani's leadership style, saying it was un-Islamic, authoritarian, and sort of deeply problematic in a number of respects. And this prompted a backlash from Ghadani, and we saw basically in June of this year a purge of the Al-Shabaab senior leadership, where Ghadani and his Amniyat internal security forces had a number of senior leaders of Al-Shabaab killed, and a number of others arrested, and a number of others fled before they could be killed or captured. And I think the Westgate Mall attack is basically the sort of repercussions of that leadership struggle within al-Shabaab. Once Gadani had sort of solidified his leadership from the end of June, I think the Westgate Mall attacks were part of a broader series of attempts by Gadani to show that al-Shabaab was still a potent force both in Somalia and across the region. And so I think that's the second thing. It gives us an insight into how Gadani's new leadership structure in Shabaab wants to operate in the region. Thirdly, I think it shows in terms of its military potency that Shabaab is still an entity to be reckoned with. This confirms the UN Monitoring Group's reports, which came out in July this year, which said that despite the progress made by AMISOM and the Somali government security forces, al-Shabaab still retains basically an operational and intact command and control structure of about 5,000 fighters. And in that sense, it remains a militarily potent organization. And we've seen in the first 6 months of 2013, the number of attacks that al-Shabaab has been able to mount, mainly in Somalia, has been escalating. We've seen on average now about 2 attacks or security incidents every day in the last 6 months between January and June of 2013. None of them really have been as big and spectacular as the Westgate Mall attack, but I think it's a trend to show Gadani's new leadership that we're still a military potent organization. The problem, I think, and this is the sort of third point about the region, I think is that although Shabaab has shown it's militarily potent, I think it's clear that it's losing the ideological battle. Al-Shabaab's ideological message has not been selling as well in Somalia as it has done in previous years. And I think we can see in that sense the attacks on the Westgate Mall are sort of a sign of Al-Shabaab's ideological and political weakness. And I think if there was an explicit rationale behind these attacks, it's probably twofold. One was to try and send a message to the Kenyan troops fighting in Somalia that we want you to leave and we're willing to attack civilians back home to encourage you to do that. But secondly, and probably more likely, is to send a message to the Kenyan people, maybe hoping that they will scapegoat or persecute Somali's population in Kenya. Now, if Kenyans unfortunately do start persecuting Somalis in Kenya after this attack, I think that would play into Shabaab's hands, because I think Shabaab's recruitment tactics have worked best when they've been able to portray themselves as defenders of Somalis against foreign influences. And this worked very well when the Ethiopians had military troops in Mogadishu between 2007 and 2009. And my guess would be that Shabaab is trying to stimulate that type of dynamic in Kenya. That's a difficult question to answer, though. I think what we can say, though, is to look at the past trends of al-Shabaab's attacks over the last few months and sort of, I suppose, speculate based on those trends if they're likely to continue or not. The vast majority of al-Shabaab attacks have taken place in Somalia, and I think that's likely to continue. And they've tended to revolve around sort of two types of tactics, if you like. There have been attempts to take out particular individuals or particularly important symbolic targets in Mogadishu itself. For example, the UN compound, the Turkish embassy, the courthouse in Mogadishu. These have been very important symbolic targets that al-Shabaab has attacked. But also then outside of Mogadishu, al-Shabaab has targeted a number of times now the sort of convoy and supply routes that AMISOM forces have been using to transfer their logistic support from the capital city, Mogadishu, out to the sectoral commands in Kismayo, Baidoa and Bella Twain. So I think we're likely to see a continuation of those types of attacks. Whether we see much more of a regional spread, I think, is much harder to tell. It's probably unlikely to see many attacks of the size and scale that we've seen in Westgate Mall, but it's quite likely that we see smaller scale attacks in sort of northeastern regions of Kenya. And Shabaab has done this before and might sort of revert to that again in the future.
Thank you for watching this week's edition of Africa Up Close. For more information about the Africa program here at the Wilson Center, please visit us at facebook.com/Africa program or follow us on Twitter at Africa Up Close. You can find more videos from the Africa program at youtube.com/Woodrow Wilson Center. Thanks for watching and have a great day.